In this second part of the social psychology series of lectures, we are going to talk about that fourth area of social psychology, the interaction between groups, perception between groups, what we call intergroup relations. Okay, and remember that social psychologists, we tend, like other psychologists, to divide up our object of study, the phenomenon we study, into thoughts, right? Feelings or emotions, and behavior. And we have special terminology for these three different parts of object of study for psychologists. In intergroup relations, we call feelings prejudice, right? A term you're familiar with when we dislike someone not because of their individual personality or attributes, but because they belong to a certain group, right? And we have negative feelings towards that group. Stereotyping are the thoughts, the expectations we have for how the group will behave. For example, So again, stereotyping is about thoughts, okay, or expectations you have about the other group, okay, and you use these thoughts that you associate with the group, these stereotypes, when you don't use individuating information, that is information that is related to the specific person, not their group membership. Okay, so that's what individuating information is. Okay? Discrimination is focused on the behavior part. Okay? Remember, again, psychologists focus on feelings, thoughts, and behavior. So this is the behavior part of how groups relate to each other. And discrimination, okay, it can be positive or negative. Okay? If you prefer hiring members of your own group, religious, racial, or otherwise, political maybe, that's positive discrimination. Okay, but if you're actively avoiding or maybe sabotaging candidates from another group, right, that's negative discrimination. All right, so that's the basic vocabulary of what we study in intergroup relations. So social categories are much like these other categories. We tend to use categories so that reality is easier to understand, right? So for example, with fruit, you could think of there being apples, individual kind of apples, oranges, individual kinds of oranges, bananas, etc. But we tend to group things into smaller units, right? Just like we do with chunking, right? In order to make the reality, the world, easier to understand. So we do the same thing with people. We tend to want to chunk them, to group them into meaningful categories. Okay, but unlike other categories of stuff, right, like fruit or rocks, or countries or other categories, right, social categories are things that we either belong to or don't belong to. Okay? And so those categories that we belong to, in social psychology, we call those in-groups. Okay? In other words, your in-group is all the people that are like you. Okay? And there are certain pronouns that we use for our in-groups. Words like us or we. Okay? Well, everyone else, to groups we don't belong to, right? And this could be racial groups, religious groups, gender, groups based on sexuality, nationality, political affiliation. Okay? All the varieties of human groups. Okay? Those that we don't belong to. Okay? In social psychology, we refer to those as out groups. Okay? And that's basically everyone that's not like you, right? They're not in the same political group, religious group, racial group, gender, right? There's this sort of distance, a difference, distinction
that we feel or perceive between us and the out group, right? So we tend to use pronouns like them, they, right? Separating, making it clear, right, that there's a distinction between this group further away from me, right, as opposed to us or we, right? The very term us or we makes you feel surrounded by your group, even if they aren't really present. Okay? And so because of those different kinds of conceptions, right, thinking of your in-group members as being part of you, they seem more familiar, right? It causes you to have two different kinds of motivations, right? More motivated towards the familiar in-group, less motivated towards interacting with or understanding the out-group. Okay? And this can lead to what's called out-group homogeneity, okay? Where you start to perceive your own group as having a lot of diversity, because you interact with a lot of members of your own group, and so you have a lot of experience, knowledge about your in-group. The information about them is more varied, okay? That's why you see more diversity, right? Whereas with the other group, fewer interactions, so that means you're probably going to rely more on stereotypes, okay? You're going to see characteristics that are more on the surface when it comes to the out group. And so they're going to look more alike to you. Again, out group homogeneity. Homo means the same. Okay, means everything appears to be the same, at least for the out group. Okay, and that's really about the different motivations we have, but also how groups are arranged. Right, neighborhoods are segregated. States are segregated. Even people of different political parties live in different states here in the U.S., right? So our experiences, right, because of motivation and also where people are placed, right, we tend to have more experiences with our in-group than the out-group. Okay. So we're going to move further into this topic, and I should say that all of the primary perspective we'll be using today as we talk about stereotyping and prejudice will be from a social cognition perspective. Okay, so combining that first sub area of social psychology and the bottom area of intergroup relations. So we're going to be very much in the heads and minds of people, how prejudice and stereotypes get expressed in that space. So not so much of an emphasis on institutional structures that perpetuate prejudice or stereotyping, and not so much of a focus on other psychological theories. For example, there's intergroup contact theory, social identity theory, integrated threat theory, conflict theory, many others. Okay, today you will primarily be learning about the social cognition perspective. Okay, but I do talk about those other theories exhaustively, comprehensively in social psychology, as well as my other course called cross-cultural psychology. Okay, but today, because what you're getting is a flavor of the different kinds of psychologies in this class, general psychology, what we will talk about a lot today is the social cognition perspective on prejudice and stereotyping, which is very much, again, in the minds of people when it looks for what is going on in regards to prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination. Okay, so let's go deeper into the social cognition perspective. One of the main questions, okay, that these types of researchers have is in how stereotypes, the thoughts we have about other groups, get maintained. Because it's obvious, that there are many people from out groups who violate those stereotypes, right? For example, you might think, or some people might think, depending on where they live in our country, right? They might have a perspective that African Americans, right, are lazy, right? That's why perhaps they have higher unemployment numbers, incarceration rates, different kinds of employment, right? Education differences, okay? One might think that, right? Well, of course, one might also think, well, there's been history, centuries of disadvantage that caused all those things, okay? But either way, there are a lot of obvious examples that violate that stereotype, right? We have a president who is African American, an attorney general, 2 that are African American, right? Several secretaries of state now that are African American. So we could go on and on and on, probably list like maybe 50 currently living African Americans who definitely violate that stereotype, right? Lots of African Americans who have more money than a lot of other Euro Americans or Americans of other racial persuasions, right? So in the face of those contradictions, how is it that stereotypes get maintained? Because even though we could easily point out 50 people, right, African Americans who violate that stereotype, the stereotypes continue to be maintained. They are, for many people, the prevalent view of African Americans. And so one of the answers to that question that social cognition researchers have come up with is subtyping. Okay, so this means that if you meet someone, okay, of the outgroup who violates the typical stereotypes, that you can form what's called a subtype, right? You can see them as something distinctive, different from the other members of their group. They are a subtype. And so most members of the group, right, they continue to behave in the stereotypic ways, but this person's an exception to the rule. Okay, you can think about a show, a cartoon show, animated show like South Park. They're very keenly aware of subtyping because if you look at the show, it's predominantly white Caucasian students, okay, at a Colorado school, rural Colorado school, which makes sense. That would be the demographic there. But there is one African American student, and what is his name? He's called Token. Okay, Token is the same thing as subtype. Okay, someone that is an exception, right? In this case, middle class, academically inclined, but African American, right? But he's an exception to all those other African Americans. He's the token, right? And President Obama could be called the token president, right? Even though we've had 2 African American attorney generals, someone could argue that too. They're the token black cabinet member, right? The idea that there are sometimes exceptional members, right, of another group, and we give them some privileged status, but we still maintain the same opinion stereotypes about the group as a whole. Okay? Think about another example using women. Okay? It might be that someone from a more rural area, right, where men make up most of the leadership, right, in politics, other areas of life, police officers, etc. A place like Oklahoma, okay, still has rigid gender roles like this, where women don't make up a large part of the leadership or high wage occupations or high salary occupations. And imagine someone, a young man, for instance, joining the military. Okay, when you join the military, you're going to come into a very intense multicultural atmosphere. Okay, because there's a lot of women in the military now, very different from Oklahoma, and a lot of ethnic minorities, people of different religions, okay, people of different sexual orientations. Okay, but a lot of times, even though you come into this context intensely multicultural, many people leave with their stereotypes intact. Okay, so a good example is someone, right, someone who might have a female drill sergeant, for instance. You might think, oh, that's definitely going to change his attitudes, right? She's way different than those women from Oklahoma, right? But he can think that, yeah, she's a really good drill sergeant, respect her, but think she's not like other women, right? Drill sergeants, female drill sergeants aren't like other women. That's why they're drill sergeants, right? And most other women aren't, right? Women like those in Oklahoma, right? Those women who still, right? He's going to think of as typical women and have expectations that maybe they're more emotional, right? Incapable of handling the physical challenges of the military. Okay. Another way in which stereotypes are maintained, and this method, this process is more insidious. What I mean by insidious is that we're often not aware of it even happening, this process called the self-fulfilling prophecy. And what it often does is create the very prejudices, right? It makes people act in stereotypic ways that confirm our stereotypes. Okay? So I'll give you two examples. Okay? We'll start off with the first study to really explore this issue. It was by Bob Rosenthal, right? And what he did in this experiment using school teachers is he told them, I gave an IQ test to some students, and half of them are what I call bloomers. That is, they have really good aptitude. They're going to become high achievers. I just know it based on my psychological test. These other students, on the other hand, that I'm also going to have you teach, the test didn't show up so well for them. Okay, it looks like they are low achievers. Okay, and just letting you know, okay, that these are the test scores for these two classes. Okay, in actuality, Bob Rosenthal gave these teachers students who had relatively the same kinds of academic scores. There were no real differences. Okay, what he was doing was changing the teachers' expectations. Okay, their stereotypes, if you will, of how these students would perform. Okay, so again, if you look here, here's just a brief diagram showing you the steps in Bob Rosenthal's studies. Again, this is from the early to mid 60s. Okay, so he administered a test to elementary school children. Right, there were no real differences in ability, but what he told the teachers, right, is that some of these students are bloomers. Okay, and then what he did is he administered another IQ test at the end of the year. Okay, because he wanted to see, did the teacher's expectations change the student's performers? If a teacher thinks that you're a high achiever, does she or he end up treating you differently? Do they actually turn you into that high achiever? And vice versa. Okay, if a teacher has low expectations about you, right, does that mean that you will end up not performing as well? Okay, so if you look here, okay, you've got bloomers in green, and you have the low achieving students. Well, they weren't really low achieving, but that's what the teachers were led to believe, right? Those students are in yellow, okay? And what you can see here, okay, is that if you look at the percentage of children who gained IQ points, that is, their IQ, became stronger, their intelligence increased, right? As a result of the teaching, you can see that they fared better. Right, there's a higher percentage of bloomers who got 20% of them actually, right, who gained 30 points in IQ. That is a huge gain. Okay, so these are good teachers, right? But what changed the outcomes for their students is the expectations they had, right? Good teachers, they got a fifth of their students to have a huge gain in IQ points. Okay, that's like 2 grade levels. Okay, but even other students, right? Some only gained 20 IQ points. That's still pretty good, and that was about half of their class. Okay, and even a modest 10 points in IQ. Okay, You see about 80% of the class was able to obtain that for Bloomers. That's a lot. Okay, whereas it was only about half for the other students. So these are good teachers, right? They're able to produce good students, but expectations can affect what? Well, what they found out based on classroom observations, okay, is that the teachers treated the Bloomers a little differently. They were treated more warmly. They received more attention, encouragement, and support from the teachers. Okay, those students who were thought to be low achievers, teachers were less, clearly from classroom observations, less invested in their students. Of course, the outcomes were different. You're not as invested in your students. How could they possibly have good outcomes? Okay, they were also given more challenging material to work on. Again, higher expectations produced higher expectations in what the students could do. Okay, so more challenging work was given. They were also given more feedback. Why? Because it's thought, right? These students can do this. So if I actually try, give them more feedback, they will improve. Okay, so it changes your whole conception of how to treat the students, right? When you think they can do really well. Okay. They were also given more chances to respond in class. That's going to build confidence, right? It's going to build connection and engagement, right? And they were also given more time to talk in class. Okay, so again, right, students are going to feel more connected and engaged and want to learn in that sort of classroom. And again, it's all based on the expectations the teacher was given. Okay, so again, the stereotypes we have about other people can change how we treat them, and it can actually lead to them confirming our stereotypes about them. Okay, here's another example using baseball players, right? So in here, a coach can form different expectations about her or his players, right? And again, it's going to lead you to treat them differently, right? You might see a different player get more attention, right? Because the coach thinks that if he works with him, he'll be better at batting or pitching, right? Whereas someone else, right, that he doesn't think is doing that good a job, they're not going to get the best position and probably the least amount of attention, okay? And the athletes see this, right? It's nonverbal cues. It's who you are spending more time with. But they'll learn, right? Oh, I'm not that great, or I must be really great. The coach is always really focused on me, right? I go home telling my mom, my dad, and everyone about how the coach is so focused on me and gives me extra time, right? Builds confidence. It makes me feel like I must be very valuable. Okay, so the stereotype starts to become internalized. Okay, you start to believe the stereotype based on how people are treating you. Okay. So another example, okay, in the early 70s, Mark Zanna and Joel Cooper, okay, they did a study to see if these same sorts of self-fulfilling prophecies could happen in an interracial interview. Okay, and so in the first study, he had whites interview black applicants as well as white applicants. Okay, and what he observed is that, first of all, white interviewers gave black applicants lower ratings. Okay, you might think, well, it's the mid-70s, right? It's racial prejudice. Okay, well, perhaps it wasn't necessarily that, right? That they just are more prejudiced. They just believe that, African Americans aren't right for this job, or isn't as qualified because he's African American. It's possible, right? But in the observations, okay, observations of the interviewer as well as the applicants, okay, what they saw is that black applicants actually did perform not as well as white applicants, okay, and they tried to understand why that was by looking at how the interviewer, the white interviewer, behaved. So for instance, okay, when they had a white applicant, the white interviewer leaned towards them more. That is a nonverbal cue that indicates that you like someone. When they had a black applicant, they leaned back more. Okay, what does that indicate? That more distance indicates more dislike. I'm not comfortable in the situation. Okay. They also smiled less, okay, when they had a black applicant. Okay, what is that communicating, right? Again, I'm not comfortable in this interaction with you. They also had a shorter interview. They talked about less personal issues in the applicant's life. Okay, less concern about the applicant, right? And what it did is it produced more stuttering, okay, more nervousness, awkwardness, speech errors in the black applicant. Okay. Well, Mark Zana and Joel Cooper wanted to do something ingenious. They wanted to see if they could actually produce the kind of behavior they saw in the black applicant in white applicants. Okay, that is, if we train white interviewers to treat those white applicants the way that black applicants are treated, maybe we can produce the same kind of stuttering, speech errors, bad interview performance. Okay, so in study 2, okay, they had white interviewers treat white applicants in the way that black applicants were treated in study 1, okay, or the way that white applicants were treated, right, in a more friendly way. Okay, and what they found is that white applicants, if you treat them the way that black applicants are treated, okay, they get rated less highly. They perform worse in their interviews. Okay, so again, the things that we see in society, whether it be high unemployment rates for some groups that seem to confirm the stereotype, right? You have to think about whether or not there's this subtle, right, interaction happening where these stereotypes are actually being created by the way that we treat each other in our society. And so that's the self-fulfilling prophecy. That's one way in which stereotypes are maintained. Okay. Another important point that social cognition has put focus on is the idea that a lot of the stereotypes we have are automatic. That is, they come to mind almost immediately without our control. They are often said to be unconscious, right? We don't control or intend to have these stereotypic thoughts, but we might encounter a member of the group or hear a joke about a stereotype about the group and laugh. Right? Somehow stereotypes have immediate resonance. They're very familiar, very available in our consciousness, right? They kind of are a heuristic that comes to mind really quickly and easily because of how repeated the stereotype is associated with the group. Okay? So there's two main methods. Okay, this research goes back to the 80s, but we'll talk about two more recent methods, evaluative priming and the implicit association test, or IAT, which measure implicit bias or unconscious bias that you might have towards a particular group. Okay, so let's talk about evaluative priming first. Okay, so this relies on methods that social cognition researchers have adopted from cognitive psychology. Okay, and in cognitive psychology, okay, it's thought, that most of the concepts that we learn, okay, are organized in our mind, okay, in related to like, okay, similarity. Okay, so for instance, if I'm thinking of a hospital, okay, it's much easier for me to then think of a gurney, a nurse, a syringe, a doctor, right, a hospital mask, scrubs. Very easy, right? If I'm thinking of that context, then it would be to think of a gun. Okay, that doesn't seem like I would think that would be in a hospital, at least maybe under special circumstances, right? Or I wouldn't think that there was a Ferrari in the middle of the hospital. That doesn't make sense. So there's certain concepts, right, that because I'm thinking of hospital, that will readily come to mind, and others that just won't because they're not related. They're not similar in any way. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay, our memories, right, what we call semantic memory, right, memory for facts, okay, organizes things with like and like, okay, based on similarity. Okay, so a way that this is measured, originally by cognitive psychologists. Okay, remember, they like to measure the time it takes you to do things, right, to remember things. For instance, in this case, they wanted to see if they could prime you. That is, if they activated that area of your mind, okay, where you're thinking about, say, hospitals, medical stuff. Does it actually make you faster at identifying words like nurse, doctor, versus words like shoes, okay, or restaurant, okay, because they're not related to the concept. Okay, and so what they find, for instance, is that if you were primed, that is, if you just saw the word nurse, some time elapsed, and then you had to identify the word doctor, you're much faster, okay, as identifying that as a word than if earlier you saw the word shoes, okay, because doctor's not necessarily related to that, whereas doctor and nurse, you can easily conjure up the image of those two people being in the same room doing something similar, right, or complementary. Okay, so again, okay, what the priming effect is, right, is if we activate part of the concept, all other parts of that concept should be faster. We should be faster at identifying, thinking about those other parts of the concept. Okay, so we call that the priming effect. Okay, and we know that it happens because, again, what we call lexical access, how fast you are at identifying, understanding a word in front of you, right? You're faster, okay, faster at understanding those words, seeing those words if you've been primed with something related to that concept, all right? And so again, right, imagine you have this network of different concepts in your brain. Some are more strongly connected, right, because you see them associated with each other all the time. So you think of a doctor, it'll be easy to think of nurse, hospital bed, the hospital itself, okay? And we also call this effect spreading activation, because what we think, again, is that like things are associated, clustered together in the mind, and other like things have their own cluster and association, right? And so what happens is doctor is activated, then it becomes easier to think of nurse, maybe things related to doctor like dentist, right? Hospital bed, right? Maybe if you're thinking about labor, if that's your specific experience, it might be cradle, baby that comes up. So there could be some individual differences, but for most people, hospital, doctor, nurse, tightly related, right? So how does this get applied to stereotypes? Okay. Well, you could think of it being working in the same way, right? If I, for example, show you images of African American men, okay, and I think that you associate them with certain stereotypes, for example, criminality, right, laziness, athleticism, okay, maybe being rhythmic, right? And so it might be that you're faster at identifying those words, right, as opposed to words not related to stereotypes about African Americans, right? And so, and it could apply to anything. It could apply to stereotypes about lesbians and gay men. It could be applied to stereotypes about Republicans versus Democrats. It could be applied to stereotypes about made-up groups. Sometimes in the lab, we do that. We tell people, oh, there's this group you've never heard about, and here's all these information about them. And then we can measure, right? Do you now associate certain things more faster with the group than before? And it often turns out to be the case, right? So we easily form these categories, right? Even if we don't believe in the stereotypes. Okay, that's what's amazing about some of this research, is that on a questionnaire, people can say, I don't believe in any stereotypes, I have no prejudices, but they'll still show these priming effects in the lab. Why is that? Because they've been exposed to these stereotypes repeatedly. Okay, so you naturally have the association in your head, okay, without necessarily wanting to. Okay, so how does the evaluative priming task work? Okay, well, first of all, a photo is shown. Okay, often the participant is told to look at the photo because there'll be a memory test later. Okay, again, that's just we're just telling the participant that so they focus on the prime. Okay, so that's what the photo is, because we're giving you a photo of a group. Sometimes it may be a word associated with the group. Okay, but what we want to do is activate your knowledge about that group by showing you an image of them. Okay, and then a short time period elapses. In this case, it's 200 milliseconds. Right, that's about 1/5 of a second. And then we show you maybe a word. Okay. So, for example, it could be words, stereotypes, but it could also be words relating to prejudice, right? Like hate versus love, okay, or disgust versus respect. Okay, so that helps us, okay, to be able to explore the associative networks, right? What words, what traits people or emotions or feelings they associate with that group. Okay. And I should say that in the original studies that Russ Fazio performed, about 80%, okay, all his participants were white college students at Ohio State in the mid to late 90s. But he usually found that around 80% of his participants had these stereotypes about African American men. Okay, stereotypes I described earlier, typical stereotypes about crime, laziness, being rhythmic, or athletic. Okay, and so 80%, okay, and most of these students reported in questionnaires that they had no prejudice attitudes, did not believe in stereotypes. Okay, so a lot of social cognition people think, that even though there's many people who don't believe in stereotypes, that they reason that we can still, find these priming effects, again, is because you're in a society where most people believe in the stereotypes, most institutions perpetuate them, the self-fulfilling prophecy is maintaining them, and so it's easy for your brain to pick up the patterns around it, the social patterns. And so you've internalized these stereotypes often, even if you don't endorse them. Okay. So here's another example. In this case, this is a German version of the evaluative priming task. They're giving someone a very quick emotional cue, right? It's almost 1/10 of a second that you see this. Almost no time passes, and then you have to identify a word. In this case, you're not using the keyboard, you're using the mouse, right? But you identify words or non-words. And again, trying to look for priming effects. Does the prime, make you faster? Does it reveal that there's an association between that prime and this other word or trait or adjective? All right. So the implicit association test is the dominant way to measure these unconscious biases these days. Okay, it's easy to find on the internet. I describe in modules an extra credit assignment where you can take an implicit association test online. Okay, maybe find out about your unconscious biases. Okay, and how this test is administered is there's two separate blocks of categorizations that people do. Okay, they see a photo or a word. For example, the IAT that measures racial bias. Okay, you'll see photos of white men or black men along with bad and good words. You have to categorize them one at a time. Okay, and in one block, okay, you're having to categorize white photos and bad words using the left key. Often it's the E key. And then the right key, often the I key, to categorize black photos and good words. And then it gets reversed for the second block. Okay, and you pair one group with one group with good, and the other group with bad. Okay, so you flip it around. Okay, and what happens is this can reveal, okay, what kind of bias you might have towards a group versus your own group. Okay, because if you find it easier to categorize white, let's say you are white, okay, and if you find it easier to categorize white photos and good words, that probably indicates that you have a more positive bias towards whites than towards African Americans. Okay, or if you find it easier, okay, let's say you're African American and you find it easier to pair black photos with good, you also might have more of a positivity bias towards your own group, okay, which makes sense. Okay, and most of the times that is true. People do have a tendency to favor their own group. The only time this is not true is for groups that are disadvantaged, stigmatized, okay, that are minorities in a society. Sometimes these groups show favoritism towards the dominant group. Okay, so African Americans, for instance, about a third show a preference for good and African American. A third are in between, and a third of African Americans who take this test often show an association between white and good. Okay, very different from white Americans, where about 80% of them, just like with evaluative priming, tend to associate good with white. Okay. And why that is, okay, why disadvantaged groups have that tendency. It's the same with the LGBT community. They too don't have a strong association between gay and good, whereas the majority of heterosexuals have a strong association between straight and good. Okay, and that can be because they're exposed to a lot of stereotypes. Minorities, there's more stereotypes circulating about them than there is about majority group members. Okay, and so they've internalized stereotypes about their group more than the dominant majority group members. Okay, and so that's why they don't have as strong a positivity bias towards their own group as dominant groups. Okay. So again, remember on the IAT, images or words appear one at a time. You're to hit the E key for stuff that needs to be categorized on the left, and the I key for stuff that needs to be categorized on the right. Okay. So here's 3 videos. They're all fairly short, but very informative, explaining to you the history, brief history. It's only been around for about 20 years or so, since the late 90s. But you can learn about the brief history of the IAT, some questions you might have about the administration, the format of the test, and also some past results that the test has had. And there's a lot of different videos here, including some from news programs, and also from PBS, Alan Alda's Scientific Frontiers. He does a good interview with one of the psychologists who continues to work on the IAT. All right. So when are stereotypes less likely to be used, right? Because so far I'm telling you something, a bleak picture, right, of stereotyping. It can be unconscious, right? It's maintained through ways that we're not exactly aware of, right? Like the self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And if we meet exceptions, we can just subtype, right? So it seems impossible to ever, combat stereotyping, right? With these very insidious ways in which it can continue to thrive. Okay? But in fact, there are many times when we don't use stereotypes. Okay? So for example, one of the best ways or the best moments when people are less likely to use stereotypes are when they know something about the person. Okay, when you know something about a person, they become an individual. Okay, we call that kind of information individuating information, because it's information that leads you to stop thinking about the person as a mere group member, interchangeable with other people in their group, but as an actual person with their own specific, unique attributes. Okay. And, often the reason we use stereotypes is because we meet a lot of people, and most of the time we don't actually know that much about them. Okay? And so when you don't know anything about them, right, it's just like when you ignore base rates and problem solving, right? You're going with what comes to mind, what you expect someone from this group to behave, right? What we call the representative heuristic in problem solving. Stereotyping's basically the same process. Okay? You're going with your expectations instead of what the individual actually has, right? Their base rates. Okay. Also, when we have our full cognitive capacity, okay, when we're not distracted, stressed, doing 3-4 things at the same time, studying for an exam, busy at work, etc. Okay, when we're able to fully think things through, okay, and notice and process all the information in an environment, that's when we're least likely to use stereotypes. See, the thing about categories is they're fast and easy. They come to mind readily. So they're easy to use when we're in a crunch, right? We don't have time to think about people as individuals because it just takes more time, right? You have to talk to them, get more information, think, process it. And so I'm not justifying stereotypes, right? But I'm just saying that this is, one way in which, they happen to occur is because there's not a lot of time sometimes to fully think out a situation. Okay? And I'll show you Susan Fisk's continuum model, okay, on the next slide. Her model describes this process over time, which she calls a continuum, and stereotypes are processes that happen very early, quickly in that continuum, whereas downstream, right, the more time that passes, these other processes that allow us to individuate, to think of the person as an individual, come to dominate our thinking more if, again, given the right amount of time. Okay. We're also motivated to avoid our bias when there are, for example, clear rules and regulations. Like, for example, if you're judging a sports competition, right, there's often clear rules, okay, that there's not a lot of room, right, for your bias to bleed through, okay, or say for admissions decisions, right, at colleges and universities, and other kinds of, things where applications are monitored, okay, like for equity, for instance, to make, or fairness, okay, in those cases, often there's very little bias that's able to influence people's decisions or people's outcomes. Okay, that's not always true, right? And it can be contested, but for the most part, it tends to reduce bias a lot. Okay. Also, when we feel we're being monitored by others, or we feel that people are not going to accept us, right? We're not talking about formal rules and regulations here. This is more of a social type of reinforcement, or sometimes social negative reinforcement, right? We're avoiding chastisement, trying to figure out what the norms are, right? So for instance, there's a lot of talk about political correctness. Society's become more politically correct. We can't make sexist jokes, racist jokes, etc., homophobic jokes, etc., right? And so that's where this part of this process is. It's more of a social change in norms, and now people are having to keep their prejudices and biases secret, okay, in order to save face. Okay, so this is one way in which people are motivated to avoid bias. It's not leading to a permanent change in attitude, right? It's just keeping your attitudes to yourself. Okay. Another way in which bias can be reduced is those people who are trying to develop, maintain what's called a progressive ideology. Okay, so this is more cultural and political contours to it, right? When we discuss ideology, right, especially a word like progressive. Okay, but roughly speaking, these are people who seek out equity. They don't want to use racial biases, gender biases, religious biases, any kind of group-based biases. They want to judge people based on merit and character. Okay, and these people have been studied mostly by Gordon Maskowitz. Gordon Maskowitz has discovered that what he calls egalitarians, roughly this is the same thing as progressives, or some of these people might call themselves liberals, but he's discovered that they have indeed less automatic bias, that over time practicing their progressive ideology, putting it into practice, diminishes, okay, their group-based biases. Far more than it does for conservatives, right? Conservatives are not interested in combating biases, more so in justifying them, right? And so those biases, racial, gender biases of all sorts, remain very strong amongst conservatives. Okay. So here's an example of that continuum model. You can see here that early on, there's the category of the person that comes up before you think about them as an individual even. Okay, and Susan Fiske says that early on, age, gender, and race especially come up early on at this level. Okay, so before I think of you as Jane, right, I'm thinking of you as a young woman, white, right, before I'm even thinking of you as an individual person. Okay, so that's what Susan Fiske would say early on happens initially. Okay, and then, you know, as further data, evidence of this person is coming into your mind and you're processing it, it might be that they don't confirm a lot of your stereotypes, right? The next thing you might notice is white, female, young, then doctor, right? Doctor is going to be contrary to some of your gender stereotypes, right? Maybe it's consistent with those other stereotypes. It might be contrary to young, right? Doctor usually kind of means maybe older man, competent, right? And young woman, often those don't kind of go together that often, right? Young means inexperienced, right? Okay. And so this can maybe lead to recategorization. Okay, so now you might think, well, doctor's more useful category here. I'm going to stop emphasizing age and gender because it's not useful, right? I'll emphasize this other category, right? Or it might be that you decide to use what's called individuation, right? And now you're not going to use categories, but you're going to use the attributes of the person and do what Susan Fiske calls piecemeal processing. That's where you process one aspect of the person at a time. It's a slower process, getting to know them, and not as fast, right, as using categories. And it doesn't produce the wealth of knowledge that categories and stereotypes give you right away at the beginning, right? It's a slower process, okay? But if you start doing that, okay, if you can get to the point of individuation, that will dominate your thinking. The category, information, stereotypes will have less of an influence on your behavior and thinking about this person, okay? Yeah, here's a complicated diagram. This is Gordon Maskowitz's model that shows the differences in how egalitarians versus racists process information. Okay, so you can see initially over there, you see an African American man. Okay, and at the top, you can see the types of goals. Gordon Maskowitz would say that for racists, 2 goals are primarily activated for them when they see someone of another group. First is, how do I use the least amount of effort to think about this person? Okay, he would say that's how a lot of conservatives think. They don't like to put out a lot of effort to think about things in general, and especially about other groups of people that they don't belong to. Okay, and so what's the easiest way? What's the easiest piece of information to use? The category, right? He's African American, so he has all these traits, okay? And, so you automatically stereotype him, okay? Or it might be you need to raise your esteem, okay? You might be doing what's called downward social comparisons, where you don't feel all that great, but if you compare yourself to a disadvantaged group, you can improve your self-esteem, right? So you're going to denigrate them. Okay, not just use stereotypes so you don't have to think much about them, but you want to actively use stereotypes to put them down. Okay, so that's going to lead to what he calls facilitation. That is, the stereotypes will get strongly activated in your mind, and they're more likely to be used in how you perceive this person. Okay, on the other hand, okay, it might be that the goal is when you see African Americans, you're egalitarian, you're going to think equity, right? I'm not going to use their group. And sometimes he says you think creatively. Okay, you're going to have to be more creative with your thinking. Invest more in how you think about this person. Okay, and focus on things that have nothing to do with their group membership, right? Be more creative about how you perceive this person. And so that leads to inhibition. Okay, they're not going to be strongly activated stereotypes for this person when they perceive what they are like. Okay, so that's what he would say are the 2 biggest, or 4 of the different processes, right? 2 that are more associated types of goals, and they lead to these different kinds of activation of the stereotype for the racist versus egalitarians. Here's some more evidence that he's developed about how unconscious biases tend to be weaker, okay, with egalitarians. Here he had egalitarians brought into the lab, and he told them to think about equality, which they do most of the time, right? Or he said, think about keeping tradition. Okay, and then he had them do an evaluative priming task. Okay, and they included photos of black men and white men in that priming task. And what he found is that stereotypes were far weaker. Okay, they were far weaker for when they thought about equality. Okay, so you see inhibition, facilitation there on the chart on the right. Inhibition means how deactivated, how weak were the stereotypes. Okay, so you go up, weaker stereotypes, opposite direction means the stereotype is stronger. Okay, and you can see in the gray, the dark gray there, much more inhibition, much weaker stereotyping when they thought about equality. But even egalitarians, if you have them think like a conservative, think about keeping tradition, it greatly increases stereotype activation. Okay, so even for the egalitarian, they have these stereotypes about the group. They're just not used often, they're not activated a lot. But if you get them in the right situation, for example, making them think like a conservative, thinking about keeping tradition, you can activate the stereotypes just as strongly as you could in people who are racist. All right. So that concludes part 2 of our lecture. And again, if these topics interest you, I am teaching a social psychology class next semester. All right.